Welcome to week 2 of your Business 560 strategy class. Today we're going to talk about the internal environment of the firm. Last week we spent a lot of time focused on the external environment with the idea that as a result of analyzing the external environment, we would generate an analysis or understand better the threats and opportunities that are confronting our company going forward. Now we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses by doing an examination of the internal environment of the firm. Once we have this complete, then we will be able to we will have basically completed the foundation of our strategic analysis, our SWOT analysis. At that point, we will turn the SWOT analysis on its head into what I call the TOES analysis, and we will try to determine what strengths we can use to overcome our weaknesses, what strengths we can use to overcome our threats, what strengths we can use to take advantage of our opportunities, etc. So let's dig into this internal assessment. Basically, when you think about this, and the way I think about it is we will use a value chain analysis, but you want to talk about what activity, what functions does your company have and that actually allow it to attain and maintain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And the way we do this is we look at the value chain. The value chain analysis basically looks at each function that the company does and looks at whether that function creates value within the organization. Simply put, when we look at the value chain, we're going to ask the question, is this something my company is good at? Or is this something that my company is not good at? If we're good at it, it's a strength. If we're not good at it, it's a weakness. Now we're gonna build this chart. We're gonna look at the primary activities contribute. And this is the definition: to contribute to the physical creation of the product or service, a sale, and service after the sale. The support activities are more overhead type activities. They are supportive. They include things like procurement, technology, development, HR, and administration. You're going to get sick of this chart because basically what this value chain is, this becomes your tool for analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of your company, your organization. Each one of these functions, we will now going to define them, and then each one of these functions, the goal is to determine whether that's a strength or a weakness for your organization. Inbound logistics, the front end, let me back up for a second to caveat all this. This value chain was built with a manufacturing company in mind. And so when you start looking at different types of companies, service organizations, retail stores, healthcare, education, the value chain is going to change to fit the organization. And so one of the first things you're going to do in your groups is you're going to work on figuring out what are the functions and what is the value chain of your organization. So inbound logistics, it talks about how we get the stuff that goes into making our product. One of the things, examples I use here is Panera Bread, since we all know them. They have bread dough making warehouses, dough making facilities scattered around the country, and they build their stores to be within 24 hours of each one of those bread making facilities in order to provide fresh bread, which is one of their big selling features. How you warehouse, how you control inventory, How do you schedule your vehicles to bring them in? Years ago, when the American car companies were suffering, they all went and tried to learn how Toyota did it. Toyota could build a car in 8 days, and it took Ford and Chevy like 20 days. And what they found out is that Toyota had developed a inventory control and warehousing or material handling system that basically allowed them, when a part came off the truck, it was that part's turn to be put into the assembly. And so they were able to be very efficient. Those things give you significant competitive advantage. The operation is basically where you put the product together, where the product is made and assembled. This really goes to, how hard is it, or how good are we at putting stuff together. Manufacturing, this can be measured a lot by, how many bad parts do we have? What's our rejection rate? How long does it take us to make one? What is the cost to make one? And we're going to talk about this a lot more, but this is where you want to look at, is our manufacturing, is our product making capability a strength or a weakness? Outbound logistics basically has to do with getting the product out of your facility and into the hands of the consumer, or into the hands of a company or a retail store, depending on what you're making. Some companies have outsourced this to FedEx and UPS. Okay, we're going to talk about that as we go forward in the class. But outbound logistics for some organizations is really not of great interest and wouldn't be included in your value chain. For example, if you were doing a study of a university, when you graduate, you're done. There's no shipping you to some other place. A retail store, once you check out with your stuff, the outbound logistics, I guess you could talk about how easy it is to check out, but generally speaking, it's pretty easy to get out of the store and back into your car. Another primary activity, which most all organizations have, is the marketing and sales activity, advertising and promotion, sales force management, pricing. Again, this is a key function, and we'll be asking the question, are we good at marketing or not? One of the things about this type of analysis is that you have to be very objective in order for it to be useful. Unfortunately, if you ask, the vice president of marketing of a company whether the marketing department's doing a good job, probably they'll say yes. And you have to be able to challenge them if you believe that that's not true. But you need to challenge them with facts, basically. And then the last primary activity is service. How do we take care of things? How do we repair? How do we train? How do we supply spare parts? All of those things are critical. Support activities involve things like procurement, getting the raw material inputs, developing relationships with suppliers, all of those types of activities. Are we good at negotiating pricing? Are we good at negotiating and getting good delivery deals and things like that? Those are things that fall into procurement activities. Another key internal support function is technology development, involving R&D, bringing to market new products, introducing technology into the company and the various functions. Those are, again, a key element. Another area is HR management. This is one of my favorites. It's hard to measure whether a company is good or bad at this in some ways, but in this day and age, I think this is becoming ultra critical to a company's success or organization's success. Can you attract and retain good employees? And if you think about, millennials and all this new generation coming out, my sense is that it's going to become increasingly important to recruit them, the best ones, and increasingly hard to keep them. And then finally, we have a general and administrative type function. I tend to think of this as management and leadership, kind of the ability of the company to have systems in place to track performance, to track how they're doing versus competitors and things like that. Is the goals and objectives of the company clear, the mission, etc. So those are things that again belong in the support area. Now, if you go back to the top, again, you get the whole, all of these functions in one place, and basically what you're going to be doing is taking these 9 areas one by one and making an assessment of what the company does in each of those areas and whether it's something that they're good at or bad at, i.e. a strength or a weakness. So as I mentioned, there are different value chains. So I think when you're looking at your company, you want to generally look at the primary value chain activities. Almost always the support system, the support functions will be pretty similar. Each company will have HR, each company will have technology, each company will probably have some form of procurement and leadership, hopefully. But these these primary value chain activities will change. And these are 2 examples in the book. One is a retail chain and one is an engineering services chain. And you can you will create one for your company. For some of the companies you're working on, you can Google the value chain. You could look at the industry you're in and Google that, automotive industry value chain, for example. You could do that. But this will be a pretty important first step, which is to develop with your group what you think the value chain, the primary value chain activities for your group or for your organization are. So we want to look at this is called the resource-based view. We're going to be looking at the internal functions. We're going to look at, as we did last week, the external environmental analysis. And we're going to look at resources that actually lead to a competitive advantage within the firm. This is an important point because when we look at our strengths and weaknesses, for example, really the question is this a sustainable long-term advantage? And the point of that is that there are companies that develop a competitive advantage, but it's not something that they can sustain. Is it easy to copy? And that becomes a problem. Is it uncommon as a resource, so to speak? And so I guess my point of this is what you want to look at, and it kind of ties into this value chain analysis, but is that strength that you've pointed to that allows you to be competitive, is it something that you can sustain as a competitive advantage over time? There are a number of types of resources that we want to look at. Physical assets, or let's see, we start with tangible resources. We start with physical assets. We have financial assets. Again, these are the types of resources that a company will look to and say, are these resources, do they give us a strength in a certain area that is competitive and a sustainable competitive advantage over time? We also have intangible resources, things that are difficult for competitors to imitate, but they're more fuzzy, if you will. They're things like human resources are they're not hard assets on the balance sheet, for example. Do we have ways of innovating that are unique and different and hard to replicate? Everybody wants to be Apple, but there's something in Apple that has allowed it to do what it does. That may have been Steve Jobs, but there is something in that organization. Reputation, brand names and the brand are a result sometimes or most times of a marketing activity or marketing relationships. So it's just important to think about these resources and how, if they are part of your strengths, are they things that can be sustained over the long haul? And again, the third area is organizational capabilities. We've talked about those a little bit in the context of these intangible resources, but sort of the organization, does it have the right culture? Does it have the ability to hire and retain capital? Does it have processes that allow it to innovate? Those are things that come out of the organizational area. Now, to determine whether these are sustainable competitive advantages, you want to look at 4 attributes. Basically, you want to look at whether the resources that you've talked about are valuable. Do they actually make a difference? Do they allow you to be more efficient or effective? Are they uncommon? Are they something that are fairly unique? Are they hard to copy? And is it easy or hard to substitute with other resources or capabilities? And so when you're looking at trying to determine whether these resources are give you competitive advantage, sustainable competitive advantage, you can build a little table like this. And the goal, of course, is to be at the bottom where you have ultimate sustainable competitive advantage, that would give you for the long term. And so when we're thinking about strategic management, what you want to think about are things that you can do to get to that bottom row in this chart, that will allow you to create competitive advantage and keep it over the long haul. Now, one of the things, so for this week, your assignment is to look at the value chain, to determine what it is, to look at the functions that you have come up with, and decide and talk about what does the company do to in each of those areas. How do they function in that function, so to speak? In the sales function, are they a direct sales force or are they going through distribution? For customer service, do they have customer service people? Is it all online? Is it all outsourced? So the question then becomes, how do you evaluate performance and determine whether in fact your company is good or bad at that function, and whether it's a strength or a weakness? And so what I do here is I talk about benchmarking. Benchmarking is a method of there's several types of benchmarking, but the one we're talking about here is basically external benchmarking, where we're going to compare financial and performance indicators to other companies within our industry. And so we're going to take a function, we're going to look at an indicator for that function, and then compare that indicator to a competitor and see if it's better or worse. I'll give you an example, and I apologize for the sports analogies, but if you're a sprinter and you go out by yourself and you run a 10 flat 100 and you go, wow, I'm fast, that's pretty good. And you're feeling pretty good about yourself. And then you go to the track meet and your competitor runs a 9.6. Well, that means that 10 flat for running the 100-yard dash actually isn't a strength when it's compared to your competitors. A better example in the organizational context is if you say, hey, I'm really good at manufacturing something. I can manufacture 10 of these items, or let's say 100 of these items with a 5% failure rate, and I can do it for $2 per unit. Well, you may think that's good, but when you compare to your competitor who's making 100 units with a 1% failure rate and does it for $1.50, you may find that per unit that it's not a strength. And so that's going to be what we're going to focus on next week, is once you've defined these functions and you've talked about how your company does each of those functions, we're going to want to come up with indicators for whether that, to measure the performance of that function so that we can then determine whether or not it's a strength or a weakness. The other reason why we want to have an indicator is that we also want to do internal benchmarking. And what that is that's when we compare ourselves to ourselves year over year. So back to my running analogy, if in 2016 I ran a 10 flat and I work really hard and in 2017 I ran a 9.8, that tells me that I'm doing better. I'm headed the right direction. If in 2018 I work really hard and I don't get any better or I get worse, that's probably not a good thing. In an organization, we used to do this when I worked at Raven. Every year we would try to take 2% of the cost out of our products. And the way we measured that is every year we would measure the cost of making a particular product and see if we hit our goal. That's internal benchmarking. So external gives you a sense of whether it's a strength or a weakness vis-a-vis your competition. Internal benchmarking really talks about whether or not I'm getting better or worse at a particular function over year. So finally, and so don't get hung up on this yet, because what we're going to do this week, we're going to start by looking at your value chain, what your company does in the value chain, and if you can get there, is start thinking about indicators for performance in each of those functions. And then next week, we're going to spend more time on the indicators. At the end of all this, you're going to come out with hopefully a sense for every one of those functions in your value chain, whether that function is a strength or a weakness. All right, thank you very much. And for those of you on ground, I'll see you in class. For those of you online, I will probably be talking to you soon.